Thank you so much, everyone, for coming out tonight. I really appreciate it. We've got a really important issue here, and I think we can learn a fair bit from what the Canadians are doing. I'm Dr. Eric Crampton. I'm head of research here with the New Zealand Initiative. We're a membership-backed think tank. Many of New Zealand's top corporates support our research. But here we're not talking about any of our research tonight. Instead, we're talking about an interesting policy idea that's coming out of Canada, where I'm originally from. As a kid in Canada, I'd seen New Zealand, and we learned from New Zealand in terms of the policies that were changed in the 1980s. I remember a W5 series on New Zealand's experiments. We learned a lot from New Zealand, and now I think it's time to turn things around a little bit. Last September and August, when we were all seeing the horrible pictures coming out of the beaches in Europe, we all wanted to help, and we wanted to do more. And we wanted to do more than the government was letting us do. New Zealand's refugee quota hasn't changed for decades, and that's not so hot when need is increasing and when New Zealand's population and our capacity to help has increased. Canada's found a way of helping without getting into some of the rancorous fights that we get into over the quota. So while New Zealand's NGOs did a fantastic job in helping to resettle those migrants and those refugees that we were able to accept through the government quota, a lot of NGOs wanted to do more, and a lot of people wanted to do more. And they had to spend their time lobbying the government, and are still having to spend their time lobbying the government to change the quota rather than getting on with the job of helping people. And it really kind of bugs me when people have to spend productive time doing unproductive things like that instead of getting on with the job. What the Canadians have found instead is a way of letting people help when they've demonstrated that they're able to help. Since November of last year, Canada's accepted 15,000 refugees from Syria through the government's quota. That's way more per capita than New Zealand's doing. But the neat trick on it is that if people wanted to help more, they can. About 10,000 more refugees have been supported through private sponsors in Canada who've committed to helping a refugee through their first year, through financing it, through helping them to integrate, and to start a new life. Whenever that kind of community support is demonstrated, Canada opens the door again and lets somebody else in, because Canadians have wanted to help. And I think we have something that we can learn there for the government to enable Kiwis who want to help to be able to do so. I don't think this should be a fight between the double the quota movement and this kind of sponsorship regime. I think that they could be integrated nicely together, where you increase the government's quota, and whenever there is willingness to do more, let people do more through a sponsorship regime like this. So I'm exceptionally happy that today we have Dean Barry with us from the Canadian High Commission over in Canberra, who knows how this program works. He's the immigration counselor there. Introducing Dean is going to be Mario Bott, who's the High Commissioner for Canada here in Wellington. So he'll come up immediately and tell us a little bit about Dean. Dean will walk us through how the Canadian system works, and then we're going to have some time for you guys who work far more closely with the issue than I do to ask questions on the mechanics and how things work and how Canada is able to solve the kinds of problems that you might think would stop us from being able to implement that kind of regime here. And I hope we can move the issue forward to find some reasonable ways that people who want to help are able to do so instead of having to fight at the doors of Parliament to try and make it happen. So thank you, and here's Mario.
Thank you, Eric. Hello, everyone. Bonjour. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you for joining us at this public forum on Canada's approach to welcoming refugees. As you know, refugees have dominated the headlines in recent years, driven by the ongoing crisis in Syria. Today, some 4.6 million Syrians are refugees. 6.6 million are displaced within Syria, and of those, half are children. This unfolding tragedy is of epic proportions, but in many respects, it's only the tip of the iceberg. According to the UNHCR, there are almost 20 million refugees across the world today, and there are further 40 million internally displaced people. In the face of this enormous human suffering, many governments around the world have stepped up and shown efforts and shown solidarity. Much has been said about Germany's leadership in Europe on this issue, and here in New Zealand, many welcome the government's decision in September to admit 750 Syrian refugees over 2.5 years including 600 by way of the special emergency intake. I know that many of you here today are involved in efforts to lobby the New Zealand government to increase the refugee quota, but with your understanding, I'll leave that topic for others and I'll just focus on what Canada's doing, and Dean will as well. As you know, Canada elected a new government in October 2015, and one of the Trudeau government's very first commitments was to bring in 25,000 refugees from Syria before the end of the year, before the end of 2015. It was a very, very ambitious target, perhaps too ambitious, and despite a very impressive effort by the whole of government, the target was revised to 10,000 before the end of the calendar year and 25,000 by the end of February. There were almost 100 special flights that brought refugees from Canada to Canada since November, and many of you may have seen Prime Minister Trudeau greeting some of them at the airport in Toronto. It sent a strong message that Canada is committed to pursuing a compassionate, open, generous, and welcoming refugee policy, and our doors are wide open to anyone who wants to contribute to our nation's success. So on February 29th, 2016, I just realized it's a leap year. Canada achieved its commitment to settle 25,000 refugees, and as of today, and Dean can probably correct this, there's been 26,202 refugees in Canada, settled in Canada, and a few thousand more are on the way. This is a significant achievement, but it was only made possible with the help of many others, including many government departments and agencies, the UN Refugee Agency, the IOM, the countries of Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey, provincial municipal governments, private sponsors, service providers, the list goes on, but with a lot of help from donations from the corporate sector and the broad support and generosity of Canadians. So we're very proud to have reached that target, but our Minister of Immigration, Citizenship, and Refugees recently stated, we're not popping any champagne because we're completely conscious of the fact there remains a lot of work to do. There are many challenges as part of this exercise, and we need to help refugees find permanent housing, to learn English or French, to get jobs, and to become normal, hardworking Canadians, just like every refugee has before. But one of the features of our refugee system is the private sponsorship program, which Dean will talk about. It allows private sponsors, whether individuals, families, churches, NGOs, to accept responsibility for refugees. The sponsoring groups provide the refugees with care, lodging, settlement assistance, and support for the duration of the period, normally 12 months, or when the refugee becomes self-sufficient, whatever comes sooner. So Canada's, we have a strong and unique tradition of private sponsorship going back to 1978, and allows Canadians to get directly involved in the refugee programs. So since the program's creation, we've brought in 250,000 people under this program. Of the 26,000 Syrian refugees that we've already resettled, 9,000 have been privately sponsored. And we've raised our targets as well by another 10,000, so it'll be 36,000 in total for this year. For 2016, we've set a target of 44,800 in total, and 1,800 will be privately sponsored. I'm an accountant by background, so you'll be hearing a lot of statistics. But to put into perspective, Canada will be welcoming between 280,000 and 305,000 permanent residents this year. So I'm very pleased that Dean's here. He's our subject matter expert, and he's come all the way from Canberra. I'd also like to thank the NZI team, particularly Dr. Harwick and Dr. Crampton for hosting us. We always look to New Zealand for creativity and innovation in policy, and perhaps in this case, Canada's experience can help inform your discussion. So best of luck with that. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Dean, over to you.
Thank you, High Commissioner. I don't like really formal speeches. I hope you don't like really formal speeches either. So I'm going to be a little bit laissez-faire in terms of my remarks. Let's have a conversation. I'll do the talking first, as my wife tells her students, and then we'll have some questions afterward. But I hope what I do in the opening part of this session helps you understand a little bit more of what we're doing and is provocative. So as the High Commissioner says, we are not here to promote this is what New Zealand should do, but good democracies have discussions like this. We learn from each other. Canada learns from New Zealand constantly. We have a program known as Express Entry, which is an expression of interest, an application management system to be able to match those economic migrants who want to come to Canada with what Canada offers. That was pioneered in New Zealand. So we have learned from that. Australia as well has done it. So we share a great many things. We learn from each other. We're very important friends and partners at a bunch of Five Nations initiatives, the Five Eyes, the Five Country Conference, which is the immigration section. So there's a lot that we can learn from each other, and as the High Commissioner said, maybe this is our chance to pay back all that we've stolen from you in terms of good ideas. So I'm happy to do that. A couple of caveats. If anyone has some very sort of specific technical questions with respect to how an application gets processed, I'm an immigration counselor, meaning that I know the waterfront in terms of the policy, and I do a lot of government-to-government relations. I'm not a visa officer. I'm very happy, though, to take any specific or technical questions back and get you answers so I can get contact details from you. Secondly, some of these slides that you're about to see, and I do apologize in advance, are a little wordy, a little dense. I'm going to take the fifth on this, as the Americans like to say, and say that this was given to me, this presentation was given to me by the subject matter experts, and they're subject matter experts for a reason. They don't do presentations for a living, and you'll be able to tell that. But I'll skate across the top of things pretty quickly and hit the highlights, leaving hopefully a majority of amount of time for questions, because again, a dialogue is the best part of this kind of thing. And I don't know if I'll do this right, but there we go. So, why do we do, and I can't see the screen really, really well, so I'll just follow along in my own notes. Why do we do refugee protection in Canada? What I would focus on here is, as with many countries, we feel that we owe a duty of care to those in need of protection around the world. But our main points that I would have you focus on are our international obligations and our commitment to protect refugees and those in need, supporting successful settlement, and I will be talking a fair bit of how where the rubber really meets the road in terms of refugees is successful resettlement, because the numbers are really a bit of a fiction. I mean, it's nice, big numbers and everything, but if you don't have success in your resettlement programs, you've got issues, and you will continue to have issues down the road. It's not good for the refugees. It's certainly not good for the country. And reuniting refugee families. And I will be touching on this point a fair number of times, because it's a key part of what Canada does and why we do certain things in the way that we do. So, that's our, as you can see, that's basically the ethos behind it, and how it works. And I'm going to be drilling down in a few different parts. So if you have an open-ended sort of question in terms of, well, that doesn't quite explain it, I may get to it. If I don't, please hit me with a question. So in our government-assisted program, the refugees are referred by the UNHCR. We also have a small program, which I will talk about, which is a blended visa program, where the government and the private sponsor pretty much join up. It's a hybrid program where we both assist the refugee. And in our private sponsorship program, we don't use the UNHCR referral. So again, there's three basic streams, and I'll be covering those. Important to note that even in the Syrian issue, the Syrian response, immigration officers who have considerable experience make the decisions. We had to mobilize a lot of people to get to the Middle East to assist us with getting that 25,000 plus in such a short period of time, but decisions were taken by immigration officials, not by someone who had their hand up and who wants to help out. That's wonderful, but these are important decisions that need people with a sound hand at the till. And they make the decisions on the basis of are we satisfied that this individual, this family, does not represent a security risk or a significant health risk. So those decisions get made by experienced people. Upon arrival in Canada, refugees are granted permanent residence. Another important point that I want to stress, once the decision is made to offer them protection in Canada, they become permanent residents and they have rights and responsibilities. I would say, let's say 80% of what a citizen has in Canada. So in thinking about increasing a quota, in adopting new policy initiatives, it's important to remember that in our situation, these are permanent residents. You broke it, you bought it, or whatever George Bush used to mangle. I think I just did the same thing. You buy it, you break it. So permanent residency is a key point of what we do, and we support them for that first year. Whether they are government assisted or privately sponsored, they are supported for the first year, both in terms of financial support and emotional and social support, unless they are self-sufficient earlier than that. And we only resettle people under the refugee program from outside the country. This is not to be distinguished from asylum class. So here's the three classes. Again, I'll start going through this fairly quickly after that. You've got your government-assisted refugees referred by the UNHCR or another agency like that. In the case of the Syrian response, the majority were referred through the UNHCR, but we also relied upon the government of Turkey to do referrals, because that's how it works in Turkey. And the assistance that the refugees get is from the government, all government services. Next, you have the privately sponsored refugees who are not referred through the UNHCR. So I had a question earlier today from a colleague who was saying, well, how does that happen versus the government assisted? They do their own referrals, and this can happen through various different ways, through organizations. So if the private sponsored organization has affiliates in source countries, that can be one way, but also refugees themselves. So once you've been brought in as a refugee, you may know of others in the same village. There's been a lot of this, for example, in Aleppo. So a town that's basically nothing like what it used to be. And there are people who've been separated who may not, follow on the same refugee application, but they're aware of others, tell private sponsors, and that's how the referrals work. But it's important to know that basically the government stays out of this part. This is for the private sponsors themselves to identify refugees. Other than, with a slight exception, for the blended sponsored refugees, we've just started this in the last few years. There's only a few thousand under this category. But this is where, let's think of it like this. You have sponsors who are looking for refugees and refugees who are looking for sponsors. So the government gets involved. We do a lot of the early heavy lifting at the start. They're referred to us through the UNHCR or another referral organization. And then we cost share and burden share, if you will, with the private sponsors. We provide 6 months of assistance. The private sponsors provide 6 months of assistance financially, but the private sponsor is responsible for the full year in terms of emotional support and integration support and that type of thing. It's fairly new. It's growing, and we're hoping to see it grow a little bit more because it solves some of the issues that we have in that gulf, that delta between government-assisted and private-assisted. So a little bit of a history lesson for you. I'm not going to focus too much on this. I want you to look at sort of 3 peaks in particular. The first, that is, as the High Commissioner was saying, so that's your the follow-on from the Vietnamese issue, what we call boat people, as they were called at the time. I don't know if that's still a politically correct term to use, but if you look in the newspapers back at that period of time, that's what we were dealing with, and that's where private sponsorship started. The government saw a need, certainly the citizens of Canada told the government that there was a need. The government reacted. And this is where we did the sort of hybrid model, if you will, where the government was going to stop doing everything. Private sponsors wanted more, so we looked to corporate sponsors, we looked for individuals, we looked for community groups, churches, other faith-based organizations, and we said, well, if you want more, then step up. And they did, and they have been stepping up for about 35 years now. The next peak that you see with the privately sponsored refugees is actually not a crisis per se, unless you're a public servant, because what we had there was a government who looked at the backlogs that we had in the private sponsorship program and said, enough, fix this. Start processing these people very fast and get it done. And they made that a public commitment, so we had to do it. And there were some legislative changes that were made at the time to be able to assist us to do that, but it wasn't a response to a global issue per se. And then the last kind of peak right at the end, and it's about to be a big peak, is right now. So you can see how we track between the government assisted and the private sponsorship. They follow along, and we'll start seeing another little line on there for that blended program, which we're hoping becomes more popular. Not everybody may be able to see this, but it essentially says, well, who can be a refugee under what stream? Essentially, the takeaway from this is the similarities between both the government assisted and the private sponsorship is that they need to be determined to be an actual refugee. Okay. Sometimes this is a bit of a problem in terms of private sponsorship, where you say, I want to sponsor so-and-so, this family, whatever, and it takes a little bit of time to make that determination. It might seem obvious, but we're a government. Nothing is obvious to a government, at least ours. But they need to be a genuine refugee. They need to be outside their country of origin, outside of Canada, and have no durable solution, no other durable solution. And so that tells us we are dealing with a situation where we uniquely need to assist this person. And that's not that different from many other governments. There's a slight difference in the legislation in terms of convention refugees, but that's a little bit less important. So we need to make an admissibility decision. Essentially, whether you're a refugee or an economic migrant or whatever stream you come through, you need to satisfy admissibility concerns, but there are a couple of exceptions for refugees. They do not need to show financial self-sufficiency. They will get there, but they don't have it right away, and we understand that. So we exempt them from that. And excessive demand on health or social services. So normal economic migrants need to prove to us that they will not then become a burden on the health system. There still is, as you may know, and I will talk about, a screening that is done for health purposes. A lot of it has to do with contagious type of diseases. We need to be assured. And it's not necessarily to say no. It's to track that, to assess what do we have here. For example, tuberculosis. You can actually be admitted as a refugee with tuberculosis. We need to monitor that. A lot of the medication that will starts out of country, and then we track that as we go in. But just to let you know that there is a couple of exemptions. However, what there is no exemption to is security. We do very, very rigorous checks to ensure, because the mandate of my department is that we are to be welcoming and to offer protection, but we have a duty of care to Canadians and permanent residents as well. So it's not a choice that we make, and even in the case of the Syrian refugees, we didn't say, okay, well, let's just dial down the security requirements. In fact, I would argue they were actually dialed up a little bit. All the attention, and plus the fact that we had a whole bunch of people focusing on this one thing, some of the economies of scale made the security vetting actually a little bit easier than they might otherwise have been, or at least have taken place in a shorter period of time, and great cooperation with other countries as well to be able to determine whether people were or were not a threat, if you will. Okay, so quickly, government-assisted refugees are referred by the UNHCR. I'm not going to say anything else about this. I think many people know what the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees does, but they're an incredibly important organization. We couldn't do what we do without the UNHCR. It just would be impossible. We don't have that kind of reach or capacity. So how do we welcome them? I'm going to talk a little bit aside from the Syrian issue. I will come back to the Syrian, the specifics of the Syrian response. But in general, this is how it works for refugees. They're destined for one of 24 cities. And why those 24? Because those are the cities, some small, some big, but they're deemed to have the right services to assist refugees. Some of them obvious, some of them less obvious. So for example, do you have in your community the kind of services that would support post-traumatic stress disorder, people arriving with major disabilities, some healthcare issues that sort of maybe not be obvious, latent diseases, that type of thing. So we need to, when anyone applies, so a private sponsor, when they apply, sorry, I was talking about government-assisted refugees. The private sponsors would be included in that 24 and beyond that. But for government-assisted refugees, generally speaking, they go to those 24, usually larger cities. They receive immediate assistance, then they receive sort of assistance along the way for that 1 year, as I said, or less if they become self-sufficient. And there's a range of different services we provide or that are provided to them: interpretation, employment counseling, trauma counseling, mental health needs. All of those things are looked after. But the assistance is not above what a Canadian or permanent resident would have received under social assistance. It is not a golden ticket. It is not a path to easy street. It's actually still quite challenging, and that's another reason why it's so important that the community gets involved. There's a lot of work to do. And as I will say probably at least a few times, the success or failure of any refugee program is resettlement and how well it's done. They get startup funding and they get monthly income support for their needs as well. They do get, traditionally, refugees are required to pay back a loan for their transportation and also their medical screening that we do. For the Syrian response, we waived that. It was deemed to be just too much of a burden. I don't know going forward how that will impact policy. So just very quickly, we do levels planning, so we identify how many, and as the High Commissioner said, we have certain targets for this year. We also do, it's important for support organizations, for the UNHCR, the IOM, to have an understanding of where we're going to go in the next few years. We try to do that. We're a little bit behind this year in terms of we've had a government changeover. So we normally would have done those targets a little further out, but we're catching up, and we've been busy. 25,000 is kind of, it's been an interesting time. So who are private sponsors? They are big organizations, they are small organizations. We have sponsorship agreement holders, large churches, large organizations that have a presence all across Canada. And they've been with us since the late 70s. So, and every year a large organization like these will sponsor refugees, and so it's very easy to deal with this group. We've got Canadian citizens who group themselves into small collectives. We've got communities that have come together in larger numbers. And that's, as I said, that's going back 35 years. So we have people from the Vietnamese movement in the late 1970s who are now private sponsors of Syrians. There's a lot of good stories out there of people who are quote unquote paying it forward. We have, as the High Commissioner said, resettled in excess of 250,000 under the private sponsorship scheme since 1978. And it's business is booming, let's put it that way. So the refugees are referred, as I said, through the private sponsorship groups. And the benefits of this are, it isn't just the government. It's, if there's resistance in your community to, well, should we let in more refugees and stuff like that? It's one thing to say that's the government that's doing that to us, but it's another thing when your own community is really stepping up. And again, if you want to look at some of the stories, it's just fascinating how communities across Canada have opened their arms. One community on the East Coast held, basically they gave away free tickets for an ice hockey game. And the entire stadium was basically full of Syrian refugees and their sponsors. Had no idea what was going on in front of them. Well, the sponsors did, but the refugees didn't. But just had an absolute blast. And that's the kind of thing the governments are not really that good at, but communities themselves do a great job at it. It certainly creates networks. As I said, there's this paying it forward of previous sponsored refugees who go on to want to do that for another cohort. And it helps with support in general, not just for refugees, but for immigration. So the refugee cases are identified by the sponsoring groups themselves, again, through various means. The assessment is done, this is the government part, right off the top, by a visa officer. They have to meet the definitions, they have to pass the admissibility and health screening checks. The government covers the cost of that part. We don't ask the private sponsors to contribute to that aspect because that's something that we have to do. It's a cost that we would have to do whether they were government assisted or not. The private sponsors do a lot of things, including welcoming people at the airport. You might have seen in the news, we had our Prime Minister who welcomed the first flight of refugees at the airport, and that was something to see. That's actually happened a lot, not with the Prime Minister so much, but a lot of our political leaders have done that. It's just they consider it an absolutely joyous thing to do. The sponsors provide the orientation, help them, and there are the obvious ones and there are the less obvious ones. Things like your kids and the kids of the refugee family, get to know them, get to talk to them, introduce them to the school. Hopefully don't introduce them to some of the horrible fashion that's in some of the schools these days, but make them feel a little bit more welcomed than I would say even a government agency is able to do. And certainly after the hours of business, you've got sort of, I don't know if I'd say 24-hour, but certainly more of a welcoming orientation. And it's working well. So I just wanted to mention very quickly the blended sponsorship. And why did we do this? As I said, because we wanted to fill that gulf between sponsors looking for people to sponsor and the refugees who probably don't have the connections in Canada looking for a sponsor. It also allows us to do some matching with very specific and urgent care and urgent need cases. So, and there are quite a few of them coming from this region, as you can probably imagine. So we have sponsors who we've identified or who identify themselves to us who have particular skill sets. A group of physicians, for example, trauma care surgeons who group themselves together and say, we want to help, but we have a specific thing to offer refugees that may be in need. And so we do some matching in that regard. And it may require that they get additional financial support longer than a year, and that's okay. That's a very tiny worded process map, essentially to say there's a mapping a matching that's done in this between the refugee and the prospective sponsor. I'm not sure if it's on this slide, but not only do we sort of have an officer that makes that connection between a sponsorship application and a refugee, but we also have a secure website we've started to use now. It strips away all the personally identifying data, but offers some characteristics that allows the sponsor to say, okay, that's the kind of match that I'm looking for. And it helps a little bit with that coordination between what will work for a particular refugee and, of course, what will work for the private sponsor, because they're making a fairly big commitment. So on to some specifics on Syria. We did resettle the 25,000, and the initial commitment was by the end of 2015. We went a little further, and you should know that it was in large part due to the big private sponsorship organizations who said to the government, hang on, we don't actually have to do it that quickly. Make sure that we have the right, facilities in place before we start, helping you achieve that commitment. So what was perceived was that the government was, hang on, we may not want to do this, or that the critics of the commitment said, no, that's not a good idea. It actually was more on the resettlement side, just saying, let's make sure we do this right. So we took a little bit more time to do it, and I think we've been successful. We spent in excess, there's lots of numbers out there. Every year, Canada spends just under $1 billion on resettlement. So Syrian crisis or no, that's what we spend. That's all, most of that money is given to NGOs, to resettlement organizations to provide those services. The government doesn't do all of it itself. It would be too difficult to do that. But we spent an additional $700 million this year just on the Syrian initiative. It's expensive. It costs a lot of money to mobilize all of those professionals, medical professionals, and retired public servants who make too much money. Oh, did I say that? But it requires a major commitment. So there are some challenges. I don't want to say that it's all just rosy. Refugees have some major barriers. These are people coming from extremely traumatic situations, and they've been traumatized for quite a long period of time. So to have people show up at the airport and say, here's a warm coat, here's a pamphlet on some government services, doesn't do it. It's a longer commitment than that. We have, under the Syrian group, more than 65% do not speak English or French. So there's a lot of initial interpretation to be done, but then there's language training, which, as you know, cannot be done in a year. You're not going to learn English or French in a year, but you're going to start, you're going to get that started, and then the refugees have to take that responsibility themselves, and they do. And in this cohort, we're seeing generally a lower comparative level of education. And so there's issues around skills recognition, and some refugees are going to face some real challenges in terms of translating what they did before to what they do now. And that's a very difficult thing for refugees to do. We try to assist as much as we can, but it is challenging. In some of the bigger cities, as anyone from Auckland can probably tell you, the availability of affordable housing is a challenge, as it is in some of our major cities. And of course, as I mentioned, the traumatic issues, the health issues are important. Something that was raised and it does come up from time to time, is this sort of criticism or critique of the refugees themselves, saying, well, this isn't what I thought it would be, or I'd like to go back to Damascus, this type of thing. And then you get this groundswell of, well, how dare they? We've opened our arms. But you have to remember, this is an incredibly, rupturous thing that's happened to them. And we then send them to Winnipeg or something, a very cold climate that they've never had to deal with before. And this is just It's traumatic in itself. But again, that's why, integration doesn't happen in the first year. It takes some time. Sorry about the Winnipeg. Okay.
I don't know, it'd be traumatic moving there from a lot of places.
So it's challenging. Okay, I said my piece on that. However, the rewards are quite obvious. That rate, it says right there, if you can't see it at the back, of eligible refugees, 88% go on to become citizens. That's a higher rate than most all other categories. And initially I thought, well, that's kind of strange, but when you think about it, is it that strange? Because in today's times, economic migrants have choices. They can look, and they're mobile, and they can move around. Refugees are presented with a pretty stark choice. A country has come to them and said, you're suffering, we want to help. They then pay back that commitment, if that's what you want to call it, I would call it a payment, to become citizens. And as I said, permanent residents get a fair number of benefits. I mean, they get all access to social benefits as a Canadian or a permanent resident would get. So why? All they get is voting, holding public office, being able to pass a top secret or a secret clearance that maybe they might not otherwise get. But them, it's extremely important. Some of the people, if you ever go to a Canadian citizenship ceremony, it may be the same in other countries. The loudest voices are often the refugees who are former refugees. It's not correct to call them refugees anymore. They've been permanent residents for years. But they are extremely proud. And some of the most patriotic Canadians you'll ever find are former refugees. So we provide some other supports. I've largely gone over this: language skills, helping them to build networks, helping them to recognize credentials or get additional education. They get access to public services, of course. They get access to medical coverage. Important to note that in Canada, our health services are largely provided by our provinces, and there can be a waiting period until they are eligible. As with any person who comes to the country, there's a waiting period before they're eligible to receive publicly funded healthcare under that province. The federal government will step in to bridge that for them. I'm going to quickly pass over questions, and I'm going to mention that we have an asylum program. It's not really the focus of tonight, but just to let you know that if you ever see some larger numbers than the actual resettled refugees, because it includes groups like our asylees and others that we provide protection to. There are the four, I did mention a little bit the joint assistance sponsorship, so those are for the higher need refugees. And I just wanted to stop on this one for just a couple of minutes. So I mentioned the sponsorship agreement holders. These are the big organizations. And it's important to recognize how important these groups are to the privately sponsored refugee program. They've been doing it, as I said, for 35 years. They are very well known to us. So when we are vetting a private sponsorship application, when we look at the sponsorship application or sponsorship agreement holders, that's a known quantity to us. We can quickly go through that. We know who we're dealing with. And also, they tend to have done their homework. They have good referral networks. They have excellent connections with the settlement community and with the service providers. So it's very easy, close to zero risk, if you will, from a government perspective. Very happy with the way that's working. They're also quite a vocal community. And for that reason, if you've followed any Canadian news in the last little while, you'll see that the sponsorship agreement holders have been a little perturbed with the government because we haven't been moving as quickly in the processing for that. The reason for that, if I can just give you a little aside, is capacity. We got to the 25,000 by doing some things that we normally don't do. A lot of people all brought together for a very short period of time to make that target. Then when we make that target, we've still got people in the pipeline, and we're going to have caps as we cap a lot of our client streams. But then what happens to people who are saying, well, wait a minute, you said, step up, make a commitment. We did. Where's our refugee? Where's our family? And so what we've had to do is, because we knew we were going to reach the cap, is to say, and the minister has said this, I shouldn't take credit for it. The Minister McCallum, the immigration minister, said, we are going to continue to process the privately sponsored refugees. And while we have set a cap, if we go over that cap, that's perfectly fine. We're going to take as many as 10,000 more privately sponsored refugees in the pipeline. We're going to process them in 2016, which means that they get priority. And how we're going to do it. They wouldn't have had to wait, or they otherwise would have had to wait. How we're going to do this? We're going to do it. That's all I can tell you. I don't know exactly how it's going to work. Everyone left and went home and did their day jobs, and now the people who are still in the Middle East are saying, yeah, I'm sure support will arrive very soon. So we're going to do it. The minister has said we're going to do it, so we're going to do it. We're good public servants. Group of 5. So other than a big organization, 5 people can come together and say, we want to sponsor a refugee. They all go on the same application. We identify and we vet those private sponsors individually to make sure they have the right financial commitment. But a lot of what we do, this applies to both Group of 5 and community sponsors. It's not a 19-page form tell us all about your life history that tells us you'd be a good sponsor. Because that's really challenging to do. What kind of questions would you ask to make sure someone is going to make a full commitment? We tend to focus then a lot more on the plan. So how are they going to do this? Tell us specifically how you're going to provide these services. And just saying, well, we'll do a good job isn't good enough. They've got to identify, so what are those services that are going to be provided? And it allows us to be able to say, okay, this group knows what they're doing and the chances of success are high. And that's where the difference lies between a successful and unsuccessful private sponsorship. And believe me, we have a lot of people who have their hand up who want to do private sponsorship, especially in the last year. We're struggling, as I said, to keep up with that demand. It's a nice problem to have. The community sponsors, a little bit smaller organization than the sponsorship agreement holders, tend to be a little bit more ad hoc. So with the series, we had a lot more of these people who never really considered private sponsorship who are now stepping forward. There's some resource materials which we can make available to you. The benefits, I've talked a bit about some of this. I've often said that private sponsorship acts as a bit of a release valve to governments. So when you're angry at your government for not doing enough, as what happened in the 1970s, in fact, it happened with the first part of the Syrian crisis, well, then you have an avenue, you have an outlet, as Eric said. It also relieves some pressure on the UNHCR. They're extremely taxed in terms of their capacity, so they quite like what we're doing in terms of the private sponsorship. I mentioned that there are some better connections that can be made through the private sponsorship. And I would also say that I don't want to overemphasize this, but we do have evidence that privately sponsored refugees do better than government-assisted refugees. So that begs the question, why? Is it on the selection side? Do privately sponsored refugees do better because they're selected, and so there's maybe a little bit of cherry picking, if you will, or identifying people who may end up doing better? Is it on the resettlement side, where they have more sort of personalized assistance than what government's offered? Probably a little bit of both. My emphasis, I would tend to support the second part of that, on the welcoming that is done by privately sponsored refugees, by the sponsors. But we need more research. Our previous government had stopped some of the research that was being done, especially the longitudinal studies that look for your success outcomes down the road, which you need to do. Our current government has said that we're going to put back some of those research initiatives, and I'm really glad to hear it, but I'm also very interested in academia of other organizations that want to do that kind of research, because I think it's absolutely needed, and I don't think government should be the only ones who are doing it. Some lessons learned very quickly. I mentioned the sponsorship agreement holders, the big ones. You working with your trusted partners from the government's perspective makes it much easier for us. There are efficiencies. We heard a lot from our service providers, that they were trying to provide services as fast as they could to resettled refugees, but they're having to stop all the time and answer the phone from prospective private sponsors saying, how does this work? How do we do this? How do we interact with you? Good questions, but people have to stop what they're doing. If you've got organizations that have done this many times, it just, you get economies of scale, you create efficiencies, easier to do it. Not to at all diminish that community spirit that comes from just individuals wanting to step up and do things. But from a government perspective, it helps. So is the history of doing this over 35 years. It's a bit of a known quantity. You're not having to convince people why to do this and how to do it. The NGOs sometimes deliver more tailored services, a little bit, and are maybe a little bit quicker to react to some of the issues that they're seeing in their communities. The ones I'm speaking of, which deal a lot with the private sponsors. And well, as I said, business is booming. So the quality of the sponsorship applications is very important. It'll take more time for the government at the start when we're doing the vetting, not only of the sponsor, but of the refugee. The more experienced, the bigger organizations just do a better job of that. But we don't leave people on their own. So we have funded a non-governmental organization to provide that sort of outreach and training to prospective privately sponsored groups, to the smaller groups in general, how it's done, how to achieve success with your application, how even to determine whether you've actually got a genuine refugee that you're looking at, because that can take time to determine that, and it's wasted time if the likelihood of success is not going to be there. So this group will help with that. They do some of their work online, they do some workshops. We obviously need to expand that more. There's a huge demand on their services. And the time issue is very important. I mentioned right now we're having to sort of catch up with all that demand. If we didn't have to do a lot of the front end work, then we wouldn't have so many sort of time lag issues. The other thing that I would mention here is management of expectations. We are victims of our own success. We announced the number, the sponsorship groups, especially on the service providers, are saying, what are you doing? We're ready. In some cases, we've rented dwellings, apartments, houses for these people, and there's nobody, and we're paying rent, and we signed a lease. So you've got to be communicating. You've got to be talking to that group all the time. And as I started, when you have a number, it's really, really interesting. And is the government going to meet its target or not going to meet its target? That's a lot less important than the success, short, medium, and especially long-term success of those refugees. So the government doing it itself and saying that we know better, at least in Canada's perspective, we found that we actually could stop and listen a little bit more. And we're lucky, if I can put it that way, is we've got a lot of people that have their fingers in the immigration pie in Canada. We have provinces that can set their own targets for certain things, to dominate the economic class, for example. And we've got a lot of people out there who are both supporters, yay, and critics all at the same time. So you got to listen to those people, and they will help you make good policy too. So that's basically, I'm going to go back only just to show a picture and ask if you have questions. I'd be more than happy to answer what I know. As I said, I'm not a visa officer. So if you're asking me what's at the bottom of page 3 on Form I-91, I can't tell you, but I can get to that information, but I'm very happy to answer the more general questions.
One of the primary systemic constraints in New Zealand is primary health care. Now, forgive me for not understanding how Canada's health system works, but I don't know any government-funded national health service in the world that's sitting there with heaps of spare capacity.
Yep.
So how does it work in Canada?
In terms of, you're talking about the first year mainly, when people come in with sort of
Or even
major,
after that?
yeah, in the severe cases, yeah. Well, I wouldn't say there's spare capacity by any means, but there's been a genuine commitment on the part of the medical community to step up. They were one of the loudest voices in saying this needs to be done, and we do have capacity. That's oftentimes the hardest argument to make to a government is, look, you're not going to fall on your face by making this commitment. We're going to be there for you. There's no doubt that it puts stresses on the system. It certainly puts stresses on the system in terms of perceptions that, look, other people are going to the front of the line before us. We have to manage that sort of cross-Canada balance of funding for health services, what the provinces are asking for, and what the federal government is willing to provide. So that's another particular issue. But a lot of that upfront money was put into, I can tell you specifically where, but ensuring that there was additional capacity to provide some of the health needs that wouldn't otherwise see, at least in the kind of space. Will we be able to maintain that? I don't know yet, and I'm not sure exactly where the differences are with the Syrian cohort as opposed to, say, what happened with the Vietnamese. I think there's lots of lessons which we were just too busy to go back and quickly look at what we did. But so far it's holding, and I haven't seen a lot of concerns raised that, you've put this humongous commitment on the medical community that we're not able to meet. And the other point I would make is that on the private sponsorship refugee, as I said, not only were they saying we should do more, they were saying we ourselves will do more. We will make commitments. We will group together with other, say, physicians and nurses and specialists. So if you've got particular cases that require this, send them our way.
I really like the idea because it's a way of persuading the taxpayer that you can take more refugees, but I just wonder a couple of slightly challenging questions. One is there a default rate for private sponsors who basically fail to fulfill their promise, and if so, what is it? And what, if any, proportion of people come out of their sort of 1 year covered by the private sponsor and actually end up having to require a lot more taxpayer resource after that first year?
Yep. I don't have the exact stat. If there is one, I may be able to find it and get it to Eric so you can tell me. The default rate is extremely small. And when there is a default, it can be on two sides of that equation. If you're talking privately sponsored refugee, it could be the sponsor, it can be the refugee family. Now, one thing that's important to note on the refugee side is that in Canada you have full mobility once you're a permanent resident, well, for anyone really. We can designate that you have been, there's been a match made, for example, with a privately sponsored refugee family. They're going to go to Saskatchewan. And it's bloody cold in Saskatchewan in the winter, and they're not particularly fond of this idea, and they miss their family. And they would rather be, if it's all okay with you, they'd rather be in Toronto, where there's a much larger Syrian community. And would that be okay? There isn't a huge amount of sort of monitoring in the private sponsorship by the government, because that would defeat the purpose. However, if there is an actual default where the refugee says, I have to go to Toronto, what the government will then try to do is to find another sponsor who's willing to take on that. Thus far, we haven't had that issue, even where there have been defaults. There's still many more sponsors than we have specific refugees in that situation. But it can also be on the sponsorship side as well. And that's why so much work is put into the vetting initially of especially those smaller organizations who just say, well, this isn't what we signed up for, this is not what we wanted. So the government, and it is sort of a taxation issue, is the government will step in both of those scenarios to either try to mitigate a successful resolution, and maybe it needs additional services that the private sponsor didn't know and maybe we didn't know. So we'll step up and do that. But I would just say overall, the numbers are still pretty small. And I think that you could say, well, the government wouldn't want to publish that kind of stuff. I don't think whether we want to do it or not makes any difference, because these would become known. There's a number of people in any country who will have great concerns about additional numbers of refugees and wanting to sort of, have an example of how something is not working. And, I would imagine, can't believe otherwise, that it wouldn't be, made known. So if we had a major problem, we'd know about it, and it would be in the press, and we'd be on the defensive. So, yeah.
I was just wondering, because you're based in Australia and they've got an interesting refugee situation, and if you thought this system would work at all, if the Australian public would have an appetite like Canadians to do something like this.
Australia does do some private sponsorship. And, I generally speaking, whether it's New Zealand, Australia, or any other country, the lessons here are good for any country, and we're still learning them from other countries as well. Would it make a difference to any country in terms of if you increased your private sponsorship? I think the lessons are there, but it's up to obviously every individual country to make up its own mind. Certainly in a lot of countries around the world, it isn't just, and I hope I made this point, it isn't just a prime minister or a president who's saying, we will meet this target and that's all you need. You really have to have the grassroots. You have to have people step up who's saying, not just you should lead, but we'll lead. If you give us the tools, if you turn the key, we'll step up. And we didn't know whether that would work in the late 1970s, but it did. And on the basis of that, we've just kept it going. Yeah.
I appreciate it was 35 years ago that you started. Do you have any institutional knowledge still in the organisation about were there any teething problems with anything that is urgent if it was to start this?
Yeah, lots. We've gotten a lot better at it for sure. I think especially on the provision of services to specific cohorts, for example, the Vietnamese community, the importance of not just interpretation. I mean, being able to translate the language is one thing, but being able to share experiences with people from your homeland, and not be made to feel or not have to feel like a complete stranger in every way, shape, or form. So we've done a lot more over the years in terms of ensuring that we didn't just meet you at the airport with a warm coat, that we looked in on you, and not just, I can say from the government side, but especially on the private sponsorship side, to have lessons learned from what worked with one group and one cohort, one family, to pass those lessons on. We also make sure to have sponsors talk to each other. They do anyway in the large groups, but those lessons learned among the sponsorship communities themselves is extremely important. So again, and we have to do this anyway, so in order to come out with what we call a levels plan, so what we identify what we're going to do in each of our categories, we have to consult with provinces, we have to consult with cities, we consult with Aboriginal communities, we consult with language communities, with ethnic groups and associations, wherever they are. And I think we've become a lot better at listening to those communities who know a little bit better than we do of what the specific issues are being faced. And that means refugees themselves. They have a voice at the table. There are refugee organizations who hold us to task, and they are constantly advising us in terms of what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong, and they do it very vocally and very publicly, and that's perfectly fine. I'm not sure my minister would agree, but I think it's perfectly fine. Yeah.
Can I just ask one last question? I really appreciate that you just mentioned that refugee voices are kind of brought to the table, and I guess my question would be that you've talked a lot about the support in the first year,
Yeah.
and particularly with the numbers that you're mentioning around the Syrians who don't speak the language,
Yes.
And there are some literacy issues.
Mm-hmm.
What are the plans beyond the 1 year? Because obviously,
Yep.
1 year isn't.
Yeah, they're not left to their own devices, so to speak. The funding that's provided through the government under that umbrella of refugee assistance, through a refugee assistance program, is there for that 1 year, but it's available to them afterward, but under different means. So it's not necessarily under the refugee umbrella, but, and some of this is federal, but some of it is provincial, and some of it is city and municipal. So those are there. I would say that over time, the burden shifts more to the refugee themselves, and in general what we find is overwhelmingly they're fine and happy to take that on. They believe, I don't have a stat for you, but I think you'd be amazed at how quickly refugees sort of get themselves back on their feet, and it's often led by the kids. The kids are there saying, come on mom, come on dad, you can do this, you can learn this language. And I mean, kids pick up language easier, but they're willing to take on challenges and convince the parents. And without their help, it seems strange to say, but without their help, this wouldn't be a success. So that's another reason why family reunification is so important. But yeah, they have services beyond that 1 year, but the sort of financial burden for that will shift elsewhere.
We need time for one more, and then we'll continue over drinks.
I guess I do direct social work practice with refugees, and I find that one of the challenges to the families is employment.
Mm-hmm.
So how can you give us like your experience on how to fix it, sort of?
Right. One thing I would say is, again, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. Even when you're talking government assistance, it's important that communities do a lot of that employment counseling, because in certain parts of our country it's very much resource-based. In others it's service, others it's a mix. So those best support mechanisms are better provided locally, and so that's why we work with the service organizations to provide those, and they know what works in their community. It's no point in training someone who doesn't necessarily come with a specific skill set because in general Canada needs pipe fitters, but in that particular area there's no requirement for that. So there's a lot of counseling that's done. Another little plug for the private sponsorship though is beyond just an Employment Canada office that has training courses and something like that. On the private side, you'll have counseling from people who actually do that job, or who could convince, say, the mother or father of that family, there are some openings in this particular area, and if you want, they could offer training at home. They can introduce the person to the boss. They would have a better knowledge in some cases than someone in a government office. So there's a fair bit of work done on employment counseling. Again, this is one of the key challenges, because some people are arriving with a skill set that just doesn't translate very well. And it may be many years before, especially if they have a professional degree, that they're able to practice. We really do not want to see people with advanced degrees in low-skilled occupations, because that's not a resettlement success, and people are going to be unhappy and nobody wins in that scenario. So I just say there's a lot done, but it's not just at the federal government's responsibility to do.
Great. Thanks. I'd like you all to join me in thanking Dean for a fantastic presentation. I understand a lot better how my own country system works now than I did before. I think it's something we could be working to implement here pretty handily. I think the questions are more on how to do it than on whether it should be done. But I really want everybody to stay and enjoy a bit of hospitality afterwards. The Canadian High Commission has generously provided some of the sponsors, not just refugees back home, but some of the hospitality here tonight. So please stick around for a drink. Our Canadians have name tags on, as do the initiative staff, but they're not going to be able to help you out so much with questions on the sponsorship program in Canada. We've got Christian and Mario and Dean here. Please stick around for a drink, and please join me in thanking Mario. Okay.